The brass gleamed under the Washington Navy Yard's afternoon sun as Secretary Harrison stepped toward the podium. Behind him, 4 silver stars caught the light, waiting to be pinned on shoulders that had carried the weight of impossible decisions across 3 decades of service. In the third row, a man sat frozen, his weathered hands gripping his program so tightly the paper had begun to tear. He was staring at a woman in dress blues, whose name he'd dismissed for 28 years, whose dreams he'd crushed with a single sentence spoken over Sunday dinner in 1995. "Sarah, you'll never even make captain. The Navy doesn't promote dreamers." Today those words would echo differently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon still hung in the Mitchell family kitchen when 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell spread her Naval Academy acceptance letter across the breakfast table. The envelope had arrived 3 days earlier, but she'd waited for the perfect moment to share the news. Sunday morning seemed right, when her father would be relaxed, reading his paper, maybe even proud. Instead, Robert Mitchell barely glanced up from the sports section of the Cedar Rapids Gazette. "Dad, I got in," Sarah said, her voice carrying the excitement she'd been holding back all weekend. "Full appointment. They want me for their strategic operations program." Bob Mitchell folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, the kind of movement that had intimidated recruits during his 20-year Marine career. He looked at his daughter with the same expression he'd worn when correcting a subordinate's poor judgment. "Strategic operations?" He let out a short laugh that held no warmth. "Sarah, that's desk work. Paper pushing. Real military leadership happens in the field, not behind a computer screen." David Mitchell, Sarah's older brother by 3 years, looked up from his own Navy ROTC scholarship paperwork. He was already committed to surface warfare, following the traditional path their father had mapped out for both his children. "Dad's right, sis. Supply chain management isn't exactly commanding a destroyer. You sure you don't want to reconsider aviation, or at least engineering?" Linda Mitchell set down her coffee mug with a gentle clink that somehow carried more authority than her husband's stern tone. She reached across the table and placed her hand over her daughter's. "Congratulations, sweetheart. This is wonderful news." Her voice was steady, warm, the kind of voice that had comforted patients through their darkest hours at Mercy Medical Center. But Bob wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and delivered the words that would haunt family dinners for the next 3 decades. "Listen, Sarah. I served 20 years. I know how this works. The Navy promotes warriors, not coordinators. You'll spend 4 years learning theory, maybe make lieutenant junior grade, but captain?" He shook his head slowly. "That's for people who make the hard decisions under fire. Strategic operations is where they send officers who can't handle real command." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd prepared for this conversation differently in her mind. She'd imagined her father's pride, maybe even his surprise that his little girl had earned what less than 10% of applicants received. Instead, she was watching him reduce her achievement to a consolation prize. "But Dad, logistics wins wars," she said quietly, remembering what Commander Rodriguez had told her during her academy interview. "Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach. Modern naval operations depend on—" "Napoleon lost," Bob interrupted. "And he lost because when it mattered, he made tactical errors in the field. All the supplies in the world don't matter if you can't make decisions when the shooting starts." David nodded in agreement, though Sarah noticed he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "The real leadership tracks are surface warfare and aviation. That's where you build the experience for flag rank. Supply officers cap out at captain, if they're lucky." The words hit like physical blows. Flag rank meant admiral. Her father was telling her that her dreams of commanding fleets, of making the strategic decisions that shaped naval policy, were fantasies. According to him, she'd chosen a path that would limit her to middle management in dress blues. Linda's grip on Sarah's hand tightened slightly. "Your father and brother have their opinions," she said carefully. "But this is your choice, your career. What matters is what you think you can achieve." Sarah looked down at the acceptance letter, its official seal and formal language suddenly feeling less like validation and more like a ticket to irrelevance. The Naval Academy logo seemed smaller now, less significant. She'd spent months preparing for the interviews, the physical fitness tests, the congressional recommendations. She'd researched every aspect of naval logistics, studying how strategic operations had evolved since World War II, how modern warfare depended on precisely the kind of coordination and planning her father was dismissing. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that someone has to make sure our ships have fuel, our sailors have supplies, and our missions have the resources to succeed. And I think that person should understand both the big picture and the details well enough to do it right." Bob Mitchell returned to his newspaper. "We'll see," he said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. "4 years from now, when you're pushing papers at some supply depot, maybe you'll understand what real Navy leadership looks like." That afternoon, Sarah sat in her room surrounded by navy blue and gold pamphlets, official documents, and preparation materials for her academy journey. The excitement that had carried her through months of preparation felt dampened, but not extinguished. She opened her laptop and began researching something she'd never considered before: the career paths of flag officers in logistics and strategic operations. What she found surprised her. Admiral Grace Hopper had revolutionized naval computing and communications. Admiral Michelle Howard had commanded task forces and fleets. The list went on, of officers who'd built their careers on the foundation of strategic thinking and operational excellence that her father had dismissed as paper-pushing. She printed out their biographies and taped them to her wall, not as inspiration, but as proof. Evidence that her father was wrong, that the path she'd chosen could lead exactly where she intended to go. She wouldn't argue with him about it, she'd simply prove it. That night at dinner, the conversation had moved to other topics, but Sarah noticed how her father's certainty seemed to fill the room like smoke. He spoke about military careers with the authority of experience, and both David and her mother deferred to his knowledge. Only Sarah sat quietly, cutting her pot roast into precise pieces, already learning the discipline that would define her career. Say less, accomplish more. Let results speak louder than arguments. She was 17 years old, and she'd just received the opportunity of a lifetime. Her father thought it would lead nowhere. Her brother thought she'd chosen the wrong specialty. Only her mother seemed to understand that sometimes the most important battles are won not by those who fire the weapons, but by those who ensure the weapons reach the right place at the right time with the right support. As she cleared the dishes that evening, Sarah made a decision that would shape the next 28 years of her life. She wouldn't try to change her father's mind with words. She'd change it with stars. The old barn behind the Mitchell farmhouse had been abandoned for years, its weathered wood gray from Iowa winters, and its floor covered with dust that danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight. But to 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell, it had been the bridge of a destroyer, the command center of a carrier strike group, and the operations room where admirals planned missions that would save the world. She'd discovered it the summer after 2nd grade, when her father had been deployed to Camp Pendleton, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Sarah would slip out after lunch, when the heat made everything drowsy and quiet, and climb the wooden ladder to the hayloft. There, surrounded by old hay bales and forgotten farm equipment, she'd arranged her command center. Cardboard boxes became radar screens. An old transistor radio picked up weather reports that she pretended were fleet communications. A collection of toy ships, some plastic bath toys, others carved from soap, represented her naval forces spread across imaginary oceans. The radio crackled with static that summer afternoon when she first heard something that would change everything. Through the white noise came a faint transmission, probably bleeding over from a commercial maritime frequency. The voice was professional, calm, reporting cargo manifests and arrival schedules. Sarah pressed her ear closer to the speaker, straining to understand the terminology. Gross tonnage, displacement, berth assignments, fuel consumption rates. The words meant nothing to her then, but their precision fascinated her. She began writing them down in a composition notebook she'd taken from her school supplies. Page after page of maritime vocabulary, ship classifications, and operational procedures she didn't understand, but somehow knew were important. When her mother found the notebook weeks later, Linda Mitchell sat down and slowly turned through pages of careful 8-year-old handwriting, documenting everything from anchor chain specifications to the difference between dead weight and displacement tonnage. "Where did you learn all this, sweetheart?" Linda asked, sitting beside Sarah on the porch swing that evening. "The radio," Sarah replied simply. "They talk about ships and cargo and schedules. I think they're planning something important." Linda smiled and pulled her daughter closer. "You know, your grandfather worked on the Great Lakes freighters before he married Grandma. He used to tell me stories about moving iron ore and grain, how everything had to be perfectly planned, or ships would sit empty in harbors while cargo rotted on docks." That was the first time Sarah understood that the voices on the radio weren't just talking about moving things from place to place. They were solving puzzles, coordinating complex systems, making sure the right resources reached the right destinations at exactly the right time. It was like conducting an invisible orchestra, where every instrument was a ship, every note was a delivery, and the music was the smooth flow of commerce that kept the world running. Her mother began bringing home books from the hospital's medical library, thick volumes about supply chain management in healthcare, logistics coordination during emergencies, and resource allocation during crisis situations. "It's the same principles," Linda explained. "Whether you're making sure hospitals have enough blood for surgery or ensuring naval vessels have fuel for missions, it's all about anticipating needs and coordinating solutions." Sarah devoured those books with the same intensity other children reserved for fairy tales. She learned about just-in-time delivery systems, inventory management, and the cascading effects of supply chain disruptions. She began to see patterns everywhere, from the way her mother organized medication schedules for her patients to the timing of school lunch deliveries that kept hundreds of students fed each day. The barn became her laboratory for testing theories about efficiency and coordination. She arranged her toy ships in formations that maximized protective coverage while minimizing fuel consumption. She created supply lines using string and push pins on a large map she'd convinced her mother to buy, tracing routes that avoided weather patterns and hostile territories she imagined into existence. She calculated load capacities, estimated travel times, and designed contingency plans for scenarios where primary routes became unavailable. When her father returned from deployment that October, he found Sarah in the barn surrounded by her elaborate naval planning scenarios. Bob Mitchell stood in the doorway, still in his marine dress blues from the homecoming ceremony, watching his daughter move miniature ships across a map with the focused intensity of a chess grandmaster. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice carrying the weariness of a long flight and the confusion of discovering his little girl had transformed their abandoned barn into what looked like a military command center. Sarah looked up, her face bright with excitement at having an audience for her work. "I'm planning a humanitarian mission," she said proudly. "There's been an earthquake in the Philippines, and I need to get medical supplies, food, and fresh water to 3 different islands. The main harbor was damaged, so I have to use smaller ports and coordinate helicopter transfers for the inland areas." Bob stepped closer, studying the detailed arrangements. Sarah had color-coded her supply routes, marked potential helicopter landing zones, and even accounted for tidal schedules that would affect shallow water approaches. The level of detail was impressive, but he saw it differently than his daughter intended. "Sarah, this is make-believe," he said gently. "Real military operations are about combat readiness, force projection, and winning battles. Humanitarian missions are what we do when the fighting is over." "But Dad," Sarah replied, moving one of her ships to demonstrate a point, "if the Marines don't have food and medical supplies, they can't fight effectively. And if we can't get them to the right place at the right time, they might not be able to fight at all." Bob knelt down beside his daughter, his expression patient but firm. "The logistics people handle that part, sweetheart. Officers focus on strategy, tactics, and leadership. The supply chain follows orders. It doesn't make the important decisions." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. The same feeling she'd get years later when her Naval Academy acceptance was dismissed at the breakfast table. She looked down at her carefully planned operation, her color-coded routes, her precisely calculated timelines. "But someone has to make sure it all works together," she said quietly. "That's what staff officers are for," Bob replied. "They implement the plans that real commanders develop. It's important work, but it's not command." That night, after her father had gone inside and her mother had called her for dinner, Sarah sat alone in the barn with her map and her ships. She traced the routes she'd planned with her finger, following the paths that would deliver hope to disaster victims, supplies to troops, and solutions to problems most people never thought about until they became emergencies. She understood that her father saw her work as playing, as the innocent games of a child who didn't understand the serious business of warfare. But Sarah saw something different. She saw the invisible foundation that made victory possible. She saw the coordination and planning that turned good intentions into effective action. She saw the difference between having a brilliant strategy and having the resources to execute it successfully. The composition notebook, where she'd first written down maritime terminology, had grown into a collection of journals. Sarah filled them with everything she learned about naval operations, supply chain management, and strategic coordination. She drew diagrams of ship loading procedures, calculated fuel consumption rates for different classes of vessels, and designed optimal fleet formations for various mission requirements. Her mother encouraged this passion, understanding that Sarah was developing skills that would serve her regardless of which career path she eventually chose. Linda Mitchell had seen enough medical emergencies to know that success often depended not on dramatic interventions, but on having the right resources available when they were needed most. "Your father thinks leadership is about making split-second decisions under pressure," Linda told Sarah one evening as they worked together in the garden, planning the layout for next year's vegetables. "And he's not wrong. But someone has to make sure that when those split-second decisions need to be made, everything required to implement them is already in place." Sarah nodded, understanding the parallel between planning a garden and planning a naval operation. Both required thinking ahead, anticipating problems, and creating systems that would function smoothly even when conditions became difficult. By the time she turned 13, Sarah's understanding of naval logistics rivaled that of many junior officers. She'd read every book about maritime operations that the Cedar Rapids Public Library could acquire through interlibrary loans. She'd studied the supply challenges that had shaped major naval battles throughout history, from the Spanish Armada's failed invasion of England to the Pacific theater operations of World War II. She learned that Admiral Nimitz had attributed victory in the Pacific to the Navy's superior logistics capabilities. The ability to keep fleets supplied across vast ocean distances had been more decisive than any single battle. The Japanese had possessed excellent ships and skilled pilots, but they'd lost the war because they couldn't sustain their operations far from home bases. This knowledge became Sarah's secret weapon, the foundation of confidence that sustained her through years of subtle dismissal and gentle discouragement. When her father spoke about military leadership as if it were exclusively about combat commands, Sarah would think about Admiral Nimitz coordinating supply lines across the Pacific. When her brother boasted about the excitement of surface warfare, Sarah would remember reading about the logistical miracles that had made D-Day possible. The barn remained her sanctuary throughout high school, a place where she could spread out charts and maps, plan hypothetical operations, and refine her understanding of how complex systems worked together. By senior year, her planning scenarios had become sophisticated enough to impress her Naval Academy interviewer, Commander Rodriguez, who recognized in this young woman from Iowa a mind that understood warfare as something more than weapons and tactics. "Most candidates want to command ships," Commander Rodriguez had told her during their final interview. "You want to ensure that those ships can complete their mission successfully. That perspective will take you far in the Navy, Miss Mitchell." But her father had seen it differently at that Sunday breakfast table, dismissing her chosen specialty as desk work and predicting she'd never advance beyond middle management. As Sarah prepared for her departure to Annapolis that summer, she spent one final evening in the barn, looking at the maps and journals that had shaped her understanding of how leadership really worked. She wasn't abandoning her childhood command center with any sense of outgrowing it. Instead, she was graduating from it, ready to apply everything she'd learned in a larger arena where the stakes would be real and the consequences would matter to more than just her imagination. The little girl who had planned humanitarian missions with toy ships was becoming a young woman who would plan real operations with actual fleets. The barn had taught her that true power lay not in giving orders, but in making sure those orders could be carried out successfully. Her father would spend the next 28 years waiting for her to learn that lesson, never realizing she'd mastered it before she'd even learned to drive. The Annapolis Library stayed open until midnight during exam week, and Sarah Mitchell had claimed the same corner table for 3 consecutive nights. Around her, stacks of textbooks created a fortress of knowledge: advanced naval architecture, fleet operations management, strategic resource allocation, and a worn copy of Admiral Mahan's writings that she'd annotated so heavily the margins looked like a second book. While her classmates crammed for their seamanship and navigation finals, Sarah was teaching herself graduate-level logistics theory that wouldn't appear in the official curriculum for another 2 years. She'd discovered early in her plebe year that the Naval Academy's approach to strategic operations was decades behind current military thinking. The textbooks focused on World War II convoy procedures and Cold War force deployments, as if the Navy still operated in a world of predictable enemies and unlimited budgets. Sarah knew better. She'd been following modern military logistics since she was 12, tracking how the Gulf War had demonstrated the crucial role of precision supply chains, and how peacekeeping operations required entirely different resource management strategies. Her applied mathematics professor, Captain Thomas Brennan, had noticed her unconventional approach during the semester's final project. While other midshipmen calculated optimal torpedo firing solutions and aircraft carrier positioning, Sarah had submitted a comprehensive analysis of fuel consumption patterns across different fleet configurations, demonstrating how strategic positioning could reduce logistics requirements by 30% without compromising operational effectiveness. "Miss Mitchell," Captain Brennan had said, calling her to his office after grades were posted, "your methodology is sound, but I'm curious about your source material. These optimization models aren't covered in our coursework." Sarah shifted in her chair, uncertain whether she was being praised or questioned. "I've been reading logistics journals, sir, military and civilian. The principles are similar, and I thought the mathematical applications might be relevant to naval operations." Captain Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of someone trying to solve an unexpected puzzle. Most midshipmen focus on tactical applications. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're thinking strategically about resource management. That's unusual for a second-year student." "My father says logistics is support work," Sarah replied carefully. "But I think understanding resource constraints changes how you approach tactical decisions. If you know your limitations, you can design operations that work within them instead of hoping supply lines will adapt to unrealistic plans." The captain nodded slowly. "Your father is former military?" "Marine colonel, retired. He believes in traditional command structures and direct action. He thinks I should focus on surface warfare if I want to advance." Captain Brennan was quiet for a moment, then pulled a folder from his desk drawer. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to share something with you that isn't part of the standard curriculum. The Navy is developing new approaches to strategic operations, recognizing that future conflicts will be won or lost based on logistics capabilities rather than pure firepower. Officers who understand both the operational and supply chain aspects of naval warfare will be invaluable." He handed her a thick report, marked with security classifications, that made her eyes widen. "This is a study of logistics failures during recent humanitarian interventions. Read it carefully. I think you'll find it illuminating." That night, Sarah spread the classified report across her desk and began what would become a transformative education in the realities of modern naval operations. The document detailed mission after mission, where tactical success had been undermined by supply chain failures, where brilliant strategies had collapsed because someone had miscalculated fuel requirements or underestimated ammunition consumption. The pattern was clear. The military's most impressive victories and its most devastating failures often hinged on logistics decisions that happened far from the battlefields. One case study particularly caught her attention. A carrier battle group had been tasked with establishing air superiority during a crisis in the South China Sea. The tactical plan was flawless, the aircraft perfectly suited to the mission, the pilots expertly trained. But the operation had been compromised when fuel tankers were delayed by a storm, forcing aircraft to return to carriers with insufficient ordnance to complete their objectives. The entire strategic position had been weakened not by enemy action, but by weather-related supply chain disruption that could have been anticipated and mitigated. Sarah began developing her own solutions to the problems outlined in the report. She created contingency matrices that accounted for weather delays, alternative supply routes that could function when primary logistics channels were compromised, and resource allocation models that maintained operational flexibility even when supply lines were stretched thin. Her work expanded beyond the original assignment, becoming an independent research project that would eventually catch the attention of the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division. She established a routine that her roommate, Jennifer Walsh from Colorado, found both admirable and exhausting. Sarah would attend classes, complete her required assignments, and then spend every free hour in the library or computer lab working on logistics problems that weren't assigned to her. She analyzed historical naval battles from a supply chain perspective, identifying patterns that revealed how resource management had influenced tactical outcomes. "Don't you ever relax?" Jennifer asked one evening, finding Sarah hunched over her laptop at 2 a.m, working through fuel consumption calculations for different destroyer configurations. "This is relaxing," Sarah replied without looking up. "I'm figuring out how to keep a task force operational for 6 months without returning to port. It's like solving a puzzle, except the pieces are ships and fuel and ammunition, and if you get it wrong, people die." Jennifer shook her head and climbed into her bunk. "You know there are people whose job it is to worry about that stuff, right? You're training to be a naval officer, not a logistics coordinator." Sarah saved her work and closed the laptop. She'd heard variations of that comment from classmates, instructors, and family members for years. Everyone seemed to believe that strategic thinking and operational planning were separate disciplines, that officers who understood combat couldn't be expected to also understand supply chains. But Sarah saw them as inseparable aspects of the same challenge. You couldn't plan effective operations without understanding resource constraints, and you couldn't manage resources effectively without understanding operational requirements. Her first real opportunity to demonstrate this integration came during a second-class summer cruise aboard the USS Constitution, a guided missile cruiser operating in the Mediterranean. Most midshipmen were assigned to rotating duties that gave them exposure to different shipboard departments. Sarah requested assignment to the supply division, a choice that puzzled her supervising officer. "Most midshipmen want bridge time or weapons department experience," Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes told her during their initial meeting. "Supply division isn't exactly a glamorous assignment. I want to understand how decisions made in supply affect operations throughout the ship," Sarah explained. "How do you coordinate with other departments? How do you anticipate needs? How do you handle unexpected situations?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes studied Sarah with the same puzzled expression Captain Brennan had worn months earlier. "Those are sophisticated questions for a midshipman. Most students are just trying to figure out basic procedures." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into learning every aspect of shipboard logistics. She shadowed the supply officer during inventory assessments, observed food service operations that fed 300 sailors, and tracked the complex coordination required to maintain everything from critical spare parts to laundry supplies, while thousands of miles from home port. She discovered that the supply division was essentially running a floating city, managing resources and services that kept the ship operational and its crew healthy. But she also noticed inefficiencies that seemed invisible to everyone else. Food waste that could be reduced through better meal planning, spare parts inventory that didn't align with actual maintenance schedules, fuel consumption patterns that could be optimized through minor adjustments to operational procedures. Sarah began documenting these observations, creating detailed analyses that proposed specific improvements. Lieutenant Commander Hayes found Sarah's reports waiting on her desk each morning, comprehensive studies that identified problems and proposed solutions with mathematical precision. "Mitchell," she said during a weekly evaluation meeting, "where did you learn to analyze logistics systems like this?" "Books, mostly," Sarah replied. "And I spent a lot of time thinking about how different systems work together." I noticed that when one department changes its procedures, it affects resource requirements throughout the ship. Small adjustments can have significant cumulative effects. The supply officer nodded thoughtfully. Your recommendations about meal planning could reduce food waste by 15%. Your analysis of spare parts inventory identified items we're overstocked on, and others where we're running dangerously low. This is the kind of systems thinking that could revolutionize how we manage shipboard resources. Word of Sarah's analytical work began spreading beyond the supply division. The operations officer requested copies of her efficiency studies. The engineering officer wanted her input on fuel consumption optimization. Even the captain expressed interest in meeting the midshipman, who was identifying systemic improvements that had escaped the attention of his experienced department heads. Captain Richard Morrison was a surface warfare officer with 22 years of experience and a reputation for running an exceptionally efficient ship. When he summoned Sarah to his quarters, she expected a brief courtesy meeting followed by polite dismissal. Instead, she found herself engaged in an hour-long discussion about strategic resource management and its impact on naval operations. Miss Mitchell, Captain Morrison said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs emblazoned with the ship's crest, I've reviewed your logistics analyses. Your recommendations could improve our operational efficiency by 20% while reducing our logistical footprint. That's remarkable work for someone who hasn't even graduated from the academy. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, still somewhat overwhelmed by the surreal experience of discussing strategic operations with a commanding officer in his personal quarters. Thank you, sir. I believe that understanding resource constraints helps identify operational opportunities that might not be apparent otherwise. Captain Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Do you see yourself as a supply officer, or as a strategic operations officer who understands supply chains? The question struck at the heart of something Sarah had been grappling with throughout her academy years. Her father and brother saw logistics as separate from command, as support work that implemented decisions made by others. But Sarah had come to understand that in modern naval operations, logistics was strategy. The ability to project force depended on the ability to sustain operations. Victory belonged to whoever could maintain effective capabilities longer and more efficiently than their opponents. I see myself as a naval officer who understands that you can't separate strategic thinking from resource management, she said carefully. The best tactical plan in the world fails if you can't execute it logistically. And the most efficient supply chain in the world is worthless if it doesn't support operational objectives. Captain Morrison smiled, the expression of someone who had just confirmed a hypothesis. Miss Mitchell, you've identified something that many senior officers never grasp. The Navy is evolving toward more integrated approaches to strategic operations. Officers who can think holistically about both operational and logistical requirements will shape the future of naval warfare. He stood and walked to his bookshelf, removing a slim volume bound in navy blue. This is a preliminary study about the Navy's future strategic direction. It's not classified, but it's not widely distributed either. I think you'll find it relevant to your interests. That evening, Sarah read the study cover to cover, then read it again. The document outlined a vision of naval operations, where traditional boundaries between combat and support functions would blur, where strategic success would depend on seamless integration of operational planning and resource management. It described exactly the kind of naval officer Sarah was training herself to become, even though she hadn't found a formal name for it yet. She wrote a letter to her parents that night, describing her summer cruise experiences and her growing understanding of strategic operations. She explained how her work aboard the Constitution had demonstrated the connection between efficient resource management and operational effectiveness. She outlined her vision of naval leadership that combined traditional command skills with sophisticated understanding of complex systems. Her mother's response arrived 2 weeks later, full of pride and encouragement. Linda Mitchell understood that her daughter was developing expertise that would serve both the Navy and her own career aspirations. But the silence from her father and brother spoke volumes. They had received the same letter, read the same descriptions of Sarah's achievements, and found nothing worth commenting on. Sarah folded her mother's letter carefully and placed it in her academy footlocker, next to the classified reports and technical manuals that had become her real textbooks. She was beginning to understand that her family's approval might never come, but she was also beginning to realize that she didn't need it. The Navy was showing her that her vision of strategic leadership was not only valid but urgently needed. Captain Morrison's words echoed in her mind as she prepared for her final academy years. Officers who can think holistically about both operational and logistical requirements will shape the future of naval warfare. Sarah intended to be one of those officers, regardless of whether her father ever understood what that meant. The testing center at the Naval War College in Newport buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of newly commissioned ensigns prepared for their specialty classification exams. Sarah Mitchell sat at workstation 17, her dress white uniform crisp despite the humid Rhode Island morning, watching her academy classmates fidget with pencils and calculators as they waited for the computer-based examinations to begin. Around her, conversations carried the anxious undertones of career decisions being finalized, of dreams being either confirmed or redirected based on test scores and interview performances. Lieutenant Jessica Park, seated to Sarah's left, was reviewing notes for the aviation officer candidate screening. "I've wanted to fly jet since I was 7, she whispered, tapping her pen against her notepad. "If I don't qualify for flight training, I don't know what I'll do." Ensign Michael Torres, directly behind Sarah, was cramming vocabulary for the nuclear power program examination. 6 months of nuclear engineering theory condensed into 4 hours of testing, he muttered. "My dad says nuclear officers have the fastest promotion rates in the Navy." Sarah opened her own preparation folder, but instead of cramming last-minute facts, she reviewed a letter that had arrived 3 days earlier. The envelope bore the letterhead of the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, and its contents had both thrilled and terrified her. Commander James Rodriguez, her former Academy interviewer, had recommended her for an experimental program that would combine traditional surface warfare training with advanced strategic operations education. The letter explained that the Navy was developing a new specialty track for officers who could integrate operational planning with logistics coordination, exactly the kind of holistic approach Sarah had been advocating since her midshipman years. But the letter also contained a warning that made her stomach tighten every time she read it. The program was highly selective, academically demanding, and career risky. Officers who excelled would be fast-tracked towards strategic command positions. Those who struggled would find themselves pigeonholed in supply roles with limited advancement opportunities. The Navy was looking for future admirals, not career logistics coordinators. "Attention on deck," called the examining officer as Captain Diana Chen entered the testing center. The room snapped to attention with the precision of recent academy graduates who still moved in formation by instinct. Captain Chen surveyed the assembled ensigns with the expression of someone evaluating raw materials for a complex construction project. "At ease," she commanded, and 43 newly commissioned officers relaxed into parade rest. "Today's examinations will determine your initial specialty assignments and shape the trajectory of your naval careers. Some of you will join traditional warfare communities with clearly defined advancement paths. Others will enter emerging specialties that offer unique opportunities and unique challenges." Captain Chen's gaze found Sarah in the crowd, and for a moment their eyes met. Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that this senior officer knew exactly who she was and why she was here. The examination consists of 3 components: technical knowledge assessment, strategic reasoning evaluation, and leadership scenario analysis. You have 4 hours to complete all sections. Begin when you're ready. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced confidence as she navigated through questions about naval engineering, maritime law, and operational procedures. These foundational topics felt familiar, almost elementary after years of intensive academy training. But as the examination progressed into strategic planning scenarios, she encountered challenges that required the kind of integrated thinking she'd been developing since her childhood experiments in the barn. One scenario presented a crisis in the Western Pacific where a humanitarian disaster had overwhelmed local infrastructure, while regional tensions threatened to escalate into armed conflict. Multiple allied nations were requesting naval assistance, but available resources were limited and political considerations complicated every decision. The question asked candidates to design a response that would address humanitarian needs, while maintaining strategic flexibility and avoiding actions that might trigger broader conflicts. Sarah smiled as she read the scenario, recognizing the kind of multidimensional challenge that required exactly the skills she'd been cultivating. She began mapping out a response that integrated humanitarian supply deliveries with strategic positioning, using hospital ships and supply vessels to establish a naval presence that appeared purely humanitarian, while actually providing forward logistics capabilities for potential military operations. Her solution addressed immediate crisis needs while creating strategic options that could be activated quickly if the political situation deteriorated. The leadership scenario analysis proved even more engaging. Candidates were presented with a series of command decisions involving resource allocation during extended operations, where limited supplies had to support multiple competing priorities. Sarah found herself designing distribution systems that maintained combat readiness while supporting humanitarian missions, optimizing fuel consumption to extend operational range, and coordinating multinational logistics networks that preserved alliance relationships while advancing American strategic interests. As she worked through the complex scenarios, Sarah realized that the examination was testing exactly the kind of strategic thinking she'd been developing throughout her academy years. The questions required candidates to think beyond traditional specialty boundaries, to understand how operational decisions affected resource requirements, and how logistics constraints shaped strategic options. This wasn't a test of memorized facts or standard procedures. It was an evaluation of mental flexibility and systems thinking. When the 4-hour time limit expired, Sarah felt the confident satisfaction of someone who had just demonstrated her core competencies. She'd encountered challenges that perfectly matched her interests and abilities. Questions that seemed designed to identify officers who understood modern naval warfare as an integrated system, rather than a collection of separate specialties. The interview portion of the evaluation process took place in a conference room overlooking Newport Harbor, where 3 senior officers reviewed candidate files while asking probing questions about career goals and strategic vision. Sarah entered the room to find Captain Chen flanked by Commander Rodriguez and a stern-looking admiral whose nameplate read, Walsh. She recognized Admiral Catherine Walsh from newspaper photographs and Naval Institute proceedings as one of the Navy's most respected strategic thinkers. Ensign Mitchell, Admiral Walsh began without preamble. Your examination scores place you in the top 5% of candidates, but your strategic reasoning responses were unusually sophisticated. Where did you develop this analytical approach? Sarah straightened in her chair, aware that the next few minutes would determine whether her naval career followed the path she'd envisioned, or was redirected toward more traditional assignments. Ma'am, I've been studying strategic operations independently since high school. I believe that effective naval leadership requires understanding both operational requirements and resource constraints. Modern conflicts are won by whoever can sustain effective capabilities most efficiently. Commander Rodriguez leaned forward, consulting Sarah's file. Your academy instructors describe your approach as, quote, systems thinking. Can you explain what that means in practical terms? Sir, systems thinking means recognizing that every naval operation involves interconnected components that affect each other in predictable ways. Tactical decisions influence logistics requirements. Resource allocation affects operational capabilities. Political constraints shape strategic options. Effective planning requires understanding these relationships and designing solutions that optimize the entire system rather than individual components. Admiral Walsh nodded approvingly. Give me a specific example of how systems thinking would change operational planning. Sarah took a breath, drawing on years of theoretical study and practical observation. Ma'am, traditional planning might design the tactically optimal solution and then task logistics to support it. Systems thinking would identify resource constraints first, then design tactical approaches that achieve strategic objectives within those constraints. Instead of forcing supply chains to adapt to unrealistic requirements, you create operations that work within logistical realities while maintaining strategic effectiveness. The 3 officers exchanged glances that Sarah couldn't interpret. Captain Chen made notes in Sarah's file, while Commander Rodriguez asked follow-up questions about specific scenarios from the examination. Admiral Walsh remained silent, studying Sarah with the intensity of someone making a significant decision. "Ensign Mitchell," Admiral Walsh finally said, "the Navy is developing a new track for officers who can integrate operational and strategic thinking in exactly the way you've described. The program combines surface warfare training with advanced strategic education, preparing officers for high-level planning positions and eventual flag rank. Are you interested in being considered for this track?" Sarah's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, ma'am. That opportunity aligns perfectly with my career goals and professional interests." "The program is demanding," Captain Chen added. "Academic requirements exceed those of traditional warfare specialties. Officers who excel advance rapidly, but those who struggle often find their career options limited. It's a high-risk, high-reward path." "I understand, ma'am. I believe the risk is justified by the opportunity to serve in positions where I can make meaningful contributions to naval strategy and operations." Admiral Walsh closed Sarah's file and leaned back in her chair. "Ensign Mitchell, based on your examination performance and this interview, we're recommending you for immediate acceptance into the Strategic Operations track. You'll begin surface warfare training next month, followed by advanced strategic education at the Naval War College. Your initial assignment will be to a destroyer, where you'll gain practical experience in shipboard operations before advancing to planning positions." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with anxiety. This was the opportunity she'd been preparing for since childhood, the chance to prove that her vision of integrated naval leadership was both valid and valuable. But she also understood that she was embarking on a career path that few officers had attempted, with no guarantee of success and significant consequences for failure. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored by the confidence you're placing in me." As Sarah left the interview room, she felt the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders like a new uniform. The Navy was giving her the chance to become the kind of officer she'd always wanted to be, but she would have to prove herself in ways that her academy classmates pursuing traditional specialties would never face. Their career paths were well established, with clear milestones and predictable advancement patterns. Sarah was entering uncharted territory, where success would be measured by standards that hadn't been fully defined yet. That evening, she called her parents from her temporary quarters at the Naval War College. Her mother answered with the enthusiasm that had characterized their relationship since Sarah's childhood interest in naval operations first emerged. "Sweetheart, how did your testing go? Are you pleased with your specialty assignment?" "Mom, I've been selected for an experimental program that combines surface warfare with strategic operations. It's exactly what I hoped for, but it's also more challenging than traditional assignments." Linda Mitchell's voice carried pride and concern in equal measure. "That sounds wonderful, Sarah. I'm sure you'll excel. What does your father think?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that her father's reaction would reflect his long-standing skepticism about her career choices. "I haven't told him yet. Could you put him on the line?" Bob Mitchell's voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent 30 years watching military careers unfold according to predictable patterns. "Sarah, congratulations on your assignment. I hope this strategic operations track gives you the experience you need to transition into real command positions." The conditional nature of his congratulations stung, but Sarah had expected it. Her father saw her specialty selection as a stepping stone towards something more important, rather than a destination in itself. He still believed that strategic operations was preparatory work for officers who would eventually command ships and battle groups, not a legitimate specialty that could lead directly to flag rank. "Dad, strategic operations is a real command track. Officers in this program are being prepared for high-level planning positions and eventual admiral rank." Bob Mitchell's silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the patient firmness of someone correcting a misconception. "Sarah, I've seen a lot of young officers convinced that staff positions would lead to great things. The Navy promotes people who make tough decisions under pressure, who lead sailors in dangerous situations, who prove themselves in real operational commands. Strategic planning is important support work, but it's not leadership in the traditional sense. Sarah felt the familiar frustration of trying to explain her career to someone who understood the military through a lens shaped by different generations and different conflicts. Her father's experience was valid but incomplete, based on a Navy that had operated differently when battles were more predictable and technology was less complex. Dad, I understand your perspective, but modern naval warfare requires different kinds of leadership. Strategic operations officers make decisions that affect entire fleets, that shape national policy, that determine how the Navy responds to global crises. We'll see, Bob Mitchell replied, the same words he'd used when Sarah received her Naval Academy appointment. Just make sure you don't get so focused on theory that you miss opportunities for real command experience. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her quarters looking out at Newport Harbor, where destroyers and frigates moved through evening maneuvers with practiced precision. She understood that her father's skepticism reflected genuine concern for her career, but she also knew that his vision of naval leadership was too narrow for the modern military. The Navy was evolving toward more complex, more integrated approaches to strategic operations, and officers who understood these changes would shape the future of naval warfare. Tomorrow, she would begin surface warfare training, learning to command ships and lead sailors in the traditional manner her father respected. But she would do so while preparing for strategic responsibilities that went far beyond conventional command experience. Sarah Mitchell was going to prove that the Navy's future belonged to officers who could think strategically, plan comprehensively, and execute operations that integrated all aspects of naval power into coherent, effective strategies. The Pacific Storm had been building for 3 days when USS Constellation received the emergency distress call that would change everything. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood in the Combat Information Center, watching weather data stream across multiple displays, while the ship's operations officer coordinated with Fleet Command about their humanitarian assistance mission to the Philippines. Typhoon Helena had devastated the Central Islands, leaving millions without power, fresh water, or medical supplies. The international relief effort required precise coordination between multiple naval forces, civilian aid organizations, and local authorities whose infrastructure had been completely overwhelmed. Sarah had been aboard Constellation for 18 months, serving as the ship's strategic operations coordinator, a newly created position that reflected the Navy's evolving approach to complex missions. While her fellow junior officers focused on traditional departmental duties, Sarah's role involved analyzing how different ship systems and capabilities could be integrated to maximize mission effectiveness. She'd spent weeks preparing contingency plans for various crisis scenarios, but this was her first opportunity to implement strategic coordination under actual emergency conditions. The storm data painted a sobering picture. Helena was a Category 4 typhoon, with sustained winds exceeding 130 miles per hour, and its path had taken it directly across the most populated regions of the central Philippines. Satellite imagery showed extensive flooding, damaged ports, and transportation networks that had been completely severed. The Philippine government was requesting immediate assistance, but standard relief protocols were inadequate for the scale of destruction they were facing. Commander Patricia Hayes, the ship's executive officer, approached Sarah's workstation with a folder containing preliminary mission orders. Mitchell, Fleet Command wants options for establishing forward logistics hubs in the affected areas. The main ports are unusable, and we need alternative approaches for getting supplies inland. What do you see when you look at this situation? Sarah studied the tactical displays showing the storm's aftermath, overlaying transportation networks, population centers, and available resources. The challenge was complex, but familiar, similar to the scenarios she'd been analyzing since her academy years. The key was identifying unconventional solutions that worked within resource constraints while maximizing aid delivery efficiency. Ma'am, traditional relief operations assume functional port facilities and established distribution networks. We don't have either. But we do have helicopter capabilities, amphibious landing craft, and the ability to establish temporary logistics bases on suitable beaches. If we coordinate with the other ships in the relief force, we can create a distributed supply network that bypasses damaged infrastructure. Commander Hayes nodded approvingly. Show me how that would work. Sarah moved to the large tactical display and began outlining her approach. Instead of attempting to restore damaged ports, the relief force would establish multiple small logistics hubs along the coastline, each served by helicopters and landing craft that could operate independently of fixed infrastructure. Hospital ships would provide medical services while supply vessels delivered food, water, and construction materials through the distributed network. The approach would be more complex to coordinate but far more resilient than traditional methods. The key advantage, Sarah explained, is redundancy. If one hub becomes unusable due to weather or other problems, the network continues functioning through the remaining sites. We can scale operations up or down based on changing conditions, and we're not dependent on any single point of failure. Commander Hayes studied the proposed network with growing interest. This is sophisticated operational planning, Mitchell. How quickly could we implement something like this? With proper coordination, we could have the first hubs operational within 48 hours of arrival. The challenge isn't technical, it's coordination. We need real-time communication between ships, clear protocols for resource allocation, and flexible command structures that can adapt to changing conditions. As Sarah outlined her strategic approach, she was implementing lessons learned from years of studying complex systems and integrated operations. The Philippines relief mission wasn't fundamentally different from the scenarios she'd analyzed in the barn behind her childhood home, just larger in scale and more urgent in timeline. The same principles applied: understand resource constraints, design flexible solutions, and create systems that could function effectively even when individual components failed. Captain Robert Martinez, Constellation's commanding officer, entered the CIC as Sarah was finalizing her operational proposal. Captain Martinez was a surface warfare officer with 15 years of command experience, but he'd specifically requested assignment of a strategic operations coordinator because he understood that modern naval missions required more sophisticated planning approaches than traditional command structures provided. "Captain," Commander Hayes said, "Lieutenant Mitchell has developed a distributed logistics approach for the Philippines mission that could significantly improve our effectiveness." Captain Martinez approached the tactical display where Sarah's proposed network was outlined in detail. He studied the plan for several minutes, asking questions about timeline, resource requirements, and coordination protocols. Sarah answered each query with precision, demonstrating that her strategic concept was backed by thorough analysis of practical implementation challenges. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Captain Martinez said finally, "this is exactly the kind of integrated thinking that makes complex missions successful. Your approach addresses the operational challenges while creating strategic flexibility. I want you to brief Fleet Command on this proposal within the hour." The video conference with Rear Admiral Thompson at Fleet Command took place in the captain's quarters, with Sarah presenting her relief operations plan to senior officers who would determine how the entire multinational effort was coordinated. Admiral Thompson was a veteran of multiple humanitarian missions, and his questions tested both the technical feasibility and strategic implications of Sarah's proposed approach. "Lieutenant, your distributed logistics concept is innovative, but it requires unprecedented coordination between multiple naval forces from different countries. How do you ensure effective command and control when you're operating through dozens of separate hubs?" Sarah had anticipated this challenge, having spent considerable time analyzing multinational coordination protocols during her strategic operations training. "Sir, the key is standardized communication procedures and clear authority structures. Each hub operates semi-independently within defined parameters, but resource allocation and strategic decisions remain centralized. We use real-time data sharing to maintain situational awareness across the entire network." Admiral Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Lieutenant, if we implement your approach and it fails, we'll have delayed aid to millions of people who are depending on our assistance. That's a significant responsibility. Are you confident this concept will work under actual operational conditions?" The question struck at the heart of something Sarah had grappled with throughout her career development. Strategic planning involved making decisions based on analysis and projections, but ultimate success depended on how well those plans functioned when confronted with real-world complications. She'd spent years preparing for this kind of responsibility, but this was her first opportunity to implement strategic operations that would directly affect human lives. "Sir," I'm confident that this approach offers the best combination of effectiveness and resilience given the conditions we're facing. Traditional relief methods won't work with damaged infrastructure, and we need solutions that can adapt to changing circumstances. The distributed network provides that flexibility while maximizing our ability to reach affected populations. Admiral Thompson studied Sarah through the video connection for a long moment. Lieutenant Mitchell, I'm authorizing implementation of your logistics plan for the Philippines relief operation. You'll coordinate with the other ships in the task force to establish the distributed network. This is a significant responsibility for a junior officer. As the video conference ended, Sarah felt the weight of operational command settling on her shoulders like a physical presence. For the first time in her career, she was responsible for strategic decisions that would directly affect the success of a major naval mission. The distributed logistics network existed only on paper and in computer simulations, but within days it would either prove her strategic thinking or demonstrate the limitations of theoretical planning. The implementation phase tested every aspect of Sarah's coordination abilities. She worked 18-hour days establishing communication protocols with ships from 6 different countries, each with their own procedures and equipment capabilities. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was cultural and linguistic, requiring her to understand how different naval forces approached complex operations and find common ground that allowed effective coordination. The first logistics hub became operational 72 hours after the task force arrived in Philippine waters. Sarah watched from Constellation's bridge as helicopters began ferrying supplies from the ship to a temporary base established on a beach near Tacloban. The sight of aid supplies moving efficiently through her planned network provided validation that months of theoretical preparation were translating into practical results. But the real test came when Typhoon Isabel, a smaller but still dangerous storm, threatened to disrupt operations just as the relief effort was gaining momentum. Traditional logistics operations would have required suspending aid delivery until the storm passed, but Sarah's distributed network allowed continued operations through hubs that remained outside Isabel's path. The flexibility she'd built into the system proved its value when confronted with exactly the kind of unexpected complication that characterized real-world operations. Commander Hayes found Sarah in the CIC at 0300 hours, coordinating helicopter schedules to maximize aid delivery before Isabel's arrival. Mitchell, you've been on duty for 20 hours straight. You need rest. Ma'am, we can deliver another 6 tons of medical supplies before the weather forces suspension of operations. The field hospital in Cebu is running low on antibiotics, and the next window for helicopter transport won't open until Isabel passes. Commander Hayes studied the operational displays showing the intricate choreography of ships, aircraft, and logistics hubs that Sarah was conducting. Lieutenant, this network you've created is saving lives, but you won't be effective if you collapse from exhaustion. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic but reluctant to step away from operations that required constant coordination. Yes, ma'am. I'll transfer coordination to Lieutenant Torres in 2 hours, after the medical supply run is complete. As Sarah finally rested in her quarters, she reflected on how the Philippines mission had validated strategic approaches she'd been developing since childhood. The distributed logistics network functioned exactly as her analysis had predicted, demonstrating that integrated strategic thinking could produce operational solutions that were both more effective and more resilient than traditional methods. But more importantly, the mission had shown her that strategic operations could directly save lives, that the theoretical planning she'd studied for years had practical applications that made real differences in the world. The after-action reports from the Philippines relief operation would eventually reach the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, where senior officers were evaluating new approaches to complex naval missions. Sarah's distributed logistics concept would be studied, refined, and eventually incorporated into standard doctrine for humanitarian assistance operations. But she wouldn't learn about that broader impact for several years, not until her name appeared on promotion lists that reflected her growing reputation as an innovative strategic thinker. Captain Martinez called Sarah to his quarters 2 weeks after the task force returned to San Diego. She found him reviewing fitness reports and preparation materials for the next round of officer promotions. The captain's expression was serious but pleased. the look of someone preparing to deliver important news. Lieutenant Mitchell, your performance during the Philippines operation has been noted at the highest levels of Fleet Command. Admiral Thompson specifically mentioned your strategic coordination in his mission summary, and your distributed logistics concept is being evaluated for inclusion in standard humanitarian assistance doctrine. Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. Recognition at the fleet level meant her work was being taken seriously, but it also meant increased expectations and greater scrutiny of her future performance. Thank you, sir. The mission demonstrated that integrated strategic planning can produce better operational outcomes. Captain Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the expression of someone making a significant decision. Lieutenant, I'm recommending you for early promotion to Lieutenant Commander and assignment to the Strategic Planning Division at Fleet Command. It's an unusual opportunity for someone with your level of experience, but your Philippines performance demonstrates that you're ready for higher-level strategic responsibilities. The news hit Sarah like a physical impact. Early promotion was rare and highly competitive, reserved for officers who demonstrated exceptional competence in demanding situations. Assignment to Strategic Planning Division would put her at the center of naval strategic development, working with senior officers who shaped fleet operations around the world. Sir, I'm honored by your confidence and excited about the opportunity to contribute to strategic planning at the fleet level. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, Captain Martinez said, using her soon-to-be rank. You've proven that the Navy's investment in strategic operations training produces officers who can handle complex challenges that traditional specialties aren't equipped for. The Strategic Planning Division needs people who understand both operational requirements and systems integration. That evening, Sarah called her parents from her quarters at Naval Base San Diego. The conversation followed a pattern that had become familiar over her years of service, with her mother expressing pride and enthusiasm, while her father remained skeptically supportive. Sarah, early promotion is wonderful news, Linda Mitchell said, her voice carrying the excitement that had characterized her response to each of her daughter's achievements. Strategic Planning Division sounds like exactly the kind of assignment you've been working toward. Bob Mitchell's response was more measured. Congratulations, Sarah. Strategic planning is important work, and early promotion indicates that the Navy values your contributions. I hope this assignment gives you the experience you need to move into operational command positions. Sarah had expected her father's conditional approval, but it still stung to hear her achievements framed as preparation for something more important, rather than as accomplishments in their own right. Dad, Strategic Planning Division is an operational command position. Officers in strategic planning make decisions that affect entire fleets and shape how the Navy responds to global crises. I understand that, Sarah. I just want to make sure you don't get so focused on staff work that you miss opportunities for traditional command experience. The Navy promotes officers who prove themselves in operational commands, not just planning positions. The conversation ended with the same fundamental disagreement that had characterized their discussions since Sarah's Naval Academy appointment. Her father saw strategic planning as preparatory work for officers who would eventually command ships and battle groups, while Sarah understood that strategic operations was itself a legitimate command specialty that could lead directly to flag rank. But Sarah's confidence in her career path had been strengthened by the Philippines mission and her selection for Strategic Planning Division. She was proving that integrated strategic thinking could produce operational results that traditional approaches couldn't match. The Navy was recognizing her value and providing opportunities for advancement that reflected her unique capabilities. 6 months later, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell reported to the Strategic Planning Division at Fleet Command in San Diego. Her first assignment involved developing coordination protocols for multinational naval operations, building on lessons learned from the Philippines relief mission. The work required her to analyze how different naval forces could integrate their capabilities more effectively, creating operational frameworks that maximized collective effectiveness while respecting national sovereignty and command structures. The Strategic Planning Division operated at the intersection of policy and operations, where theoretical strategic concepts were translated into practical guidance for fleet commanders. Sarah found herself working with senior officers who shared her understanding that modern naval warfare required more sophisticated approaches than traditional command structures provided. These were the Navy's strategic thinkers, the officers who designed the operational concepts that shaped how naval forces responded to global challenges. Rear Admiral Elizabeth Foster, who headed the Strategic Planning Division, had specifically requested Sarah's assignment based on her Philippines performance and her reputation for innovative operational thinking. Admiral Foster was herself a strategic operations officer who had built her career on integrated approaches to complex missions. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, Admiral Foster said during Sarah's initial briefing, "The Strategic Planning Division is where the Navy develops its future operational concepts. Officers assigned here shape how naval forces will operate for the next decade and beyond. Your work on distributed logistics operations demonstrates exactly the kind of systems thinking we need for increasingly complex operational environments." Sarah's assignment to Strategic Planning Division represented validation of the career path she'd pursued since her Naval Academy years. She was working at the highest levels of naval strategic development, contributing to operational concepts that would influence fleet operations worldwide. The theoretical planning she'd studied for years was being translated into practical guidance that would shape how naval forces responded to crises, conflicts, and humanitarian emergencies. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah was proving that her father's narrow definition of naval leadership was incomplete. Strategic operations officers weren't support personnel who implemented decisions made by others. They were the strategic thinkers who designed the operational frameworks that made effective naval power possible. The Navy's future belonged to officers who could integrate operational planning with resource management, who understood complex systems and could design solutions that worked within real-world constraints. As Lieutenant Commander Mitchell settled into her new responsibilities at Strategic Planning Division, she was building a reputation as one of the Navy's most innovative strategic thinkers. Her distributed logistics concepts were being studied and refined for application to various operational scenarios. Her approach to multinational coordination was influencing how the Navy structured complex coalition operations. The little girl who had planned humanitarian missions with toy ships in an Iowa barn was becoming a strategic operations officer whose work influenced how real fleets responded to real crises. The path from childhood games to strategic planning had been longer and more complex than Sarah had originally envisioned, but it had led exactly where she'd intended to go. She was proving that strategic operations was not just a legitimate military specialty, but a crucial one that would define the future of naval warfare. And somewhere in Cedar Rapids, Bob Mitchell was beginning to understand that his daughter's career was developing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The newspaper clippings that Linda Mitchell collected about naval operations increasingly featured strategic planning concepts that sounded remarkably similar to approaches Sarah had described in her letters home. The Navy was evolving toward more integrated, more sophisticated operational methods, and officers who understood these changes were advancing rapidly through the ranks. Sarah Mitchell was becoming exactly the kind of naval officer she'd envisioned during those childhood planning sessions in the barn. The only question remaining was whether her father would recognize her achievement before she reached the flag rank that would make her success undeniable. But increasingly, that recognition seemed less important than it once had. Sarah was proving herself to the people who mattered most: the naval officers who understood strategic operations, and the sailors whose lives depended on effective planning and coordination. The Navy had given her the opportunity to become the strategic leader she'd always wanted to be. Now she just had to continue proving that her vision of integrated naval leadership was not only valid, but essential for the challenges the Navy would face in an increasingly complex world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.